Okay, guys. This is the second week of recording, so content week 2. What we're going to be doing today is we're going to be talking about various developmental theories of psychology, and just kind of giving a brief overview of them. Okay, but some first housekeeping matters before we begin. I'm going to be posting weeks 2 and 3 tonight because I'm posting this kind of late, and I do apologize for that. I've been jumping from state to state over the past week for internship interviews, and I just haven't had an opportunity to sit down and get this knocked out. So I want to apologize to you for that and make up for it by posting weeks 2 and 3. Okay. Again, I appreciate your flexibility on that. So, another matter of housekeeping is I hope that you are continuing to read your Reciprocating Self book. There's a lot of reading this week. I understand. I appreciate your efforts to get that taken care of. I hope that you're staying up with this because there's a lot of new material in this, as well as hopefully deep material. So I hope you're getting a lot out of it, and hopefully that will come out in the discussion questions that we have. We have a Blackboard Collaborate. It's no longer WIMBA. We're not using WIMBA anymore. So we have a Blackboard Collaborate meeting on January 21st at 7 p.m. So please have gone through and familiarized yourself with Blackboard Collaborate before then. During that time, we'll talk about the reciprocating self, talk about any questions you have about the PowerPoints, and just kind of discuss where you're at with your groups and the topics you have for that. So look forward to that. So let's get started here. So in today's class, what we're going to talk about are some major theories that guide developmental psychology. Freud, Vygotsky, Bandura, Bond and Brenners. But what we're really going to focus in on pretty heavily is Erikson and Haddinghurst and their psychosocial developmental theories. And then we're going to kind of review real fast the operational orientation to religious and spiritual development. We're going to re-review that. That was also on your week 1 content. So that's coming up. So let's talk about Freud's theory. Now, regardless of what you really think about Freud, he really did make an effort to really organize psychology and understand human psyche. And in order to do this, he created his model of consciousness, in which he proposed that there were 3 levels: conscious, preconscious, and unconscious. And he expanded upon that with the concept of the id, ego, and superego, and the psychosexual stages. So we'll get into that in just a second. So first, I'd like to talk about the iceberg theory. Okay, Freud conceptualized human consciousness in terms of 3 levels: conscious, preconscious, and unconscious, or subconscious, depending on how you have learned it. At the conscious level is our thoughts and perceptions. So you're perceiving me up on your screen talking about the slides, and that is conscious. Preconscious level is a step below. So this is memories, sensory awareness, things like that, things that you aren't exactly aware of, but you can easily recall. So, for instance, your phone number. I'm sure that some of you just thought about what your phone number is. Or you are breathing right now. And guess what? You just paid attention to that. So, those sorts of things. Things that are just outside of our awareness, but they can be recalled and into conscious awareness very quickly. The unconscious level, though, that is a lot harder to access at the conscious level, and that's what Freud suggested requires psychoanalysis. And the unconscious level is like our motivations. It's our drives. It's the things that push us to do what we do, feel the way we feel, and relate the way we relate. And so this is things like our defense mechanisms, things like our previous relationships that we've had and how they have impacted us, typically during childhood. Things of that nature. And it's the things that are considered shameful, perhaps, our deepest, darkest desires, as it were. So those are what Freud really kind of focused in on in terms of psychoanalysis, to try to bring this up to this. Okay. Now he also came up with the concept of the id, ego, and superego. Now think of this in terms of like a seesaw. Okay, with the id on one end, the superego on the other, and the ego acting like the pivot point, trying to keep those two in balance. The id wants it, and it wants it now, and it is going to do anything it can do to get a hold of it, whatever it is. Okay, it's hedonistic, it's selfish, it's base and animalistic in nature. On the opposite end of the seesaw, you've got the superego. And the superego is our internalized messages from society and culture, family to whatever. And it's what tells us, no, you cannot have that, you are bad for wanting that, you are shameful for wanting that. What would your mother think? Your dad never wanted you to do this career, why are you doing that? That sort of thing. The ego acts as kind of a mediator between those two, keeping them in balance. Remember, as a seesaw. And it says, well, I'll hear both the id and the superego, and then I will make a decision as to how I'm going to do it. And perhaps I will go after whatever it is, but I will do so in a controlled and organized fashion to manage the superego's shamings. So that's kind of what the id, ego, and superego, how they relate to one another in Freud's theory. Now, Freud explained how these concepts sort of develop through his psychosexual model. Okay, and this has 5 stages from the oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital stages. And you can see the ages that roughly correspond to that. But let's talk about what these are and what it means to have a fixation in one of these stages. So the oral stage, basically the infant takes everything in through its mouth, from sustenance to sensory information, and it makes sense of the world through its mouth. Well, if you have an oral fixation, then you gain comfort and cope with stressors and things like that through what you put in your mouth. Freud said that he had a oral fixation. You never see a picture of him without a big old cigar in his hand. The anal stage corresponds roughly to whenever we start potty training, and this deals with this is a point at which many children internalize messages of shame about their bodies, because parents might say things like ooh, you made a stinky, or something of that nature. And the kid will take into themselves that, okay, I can't do that, that's bad. And they will start becoming very organized, perhaps cleanly, obsessive about cleaning, perfectionistic perhaps, and that is where an anal fixation occurs, and that called anal retentiveness. You can go on the opposite end of that spectrum, though, and have anal expulsive, in which an individual will be sloppy, disorganized, uncaring, and just kind of generally slovenly. And so it's basically kind of the difference between type A and B personalities. The phallic stage is where you kind of hear a lot about Freud's Oedipal or Electra complexes. Those are the fixations in this particular stage. And during this stage, the child tries to gain the affection of the opposite gendered parent and kind of rebels against the same gendered parent. So a boy will rebel against his dad, or a girl will rebel against her mother in order to gain the affection of either the mother or the father, respectively. In the Oedipal complex is what Freud called when a child desires to kill the same-sex parent in order to be with the opposite gendered parent. But in order to control these negative, desires, these perceivably shameful thoughts, the child begins to identify, kind of paradoxically identify, with the same gendered parent. So that is how they kind of navigate out of this stage, is through the identification with the same gendered parent. The latency stage, Freud didn't really say much about it because, he said it was kind of a neutral age for the child in which they relate with their same gendered peers. However, some theorists suggest that this could be an age at which homosexual urges begin to manifest through their interactions with same-gendered peers. So some psychoanalytic theorists, have kind of expanded upon that theory, or that particular stage in that direction. And then the genital stage kind of occurs at just before puberty or at the onset of puberty, and that's where children begin to kind of push against their parents, individualize themselves, and move forward as people of their own self. Okay. So Freud had a lot of acolytes. He had people who came to him and wanted to learn his theory. But after some time, they began to say, well, I really don't agree with that aspect of your theory, or let's tweak this a little bit. And the age of the Neo-Freudian was born. Some of the major Neo-Freudian theories are ego psychology, object relation psychology, and attachment theory. We'll talk about attachment theory next week in greater depth. So let's focus in right this second on ego psychology. Ego psychology was really kind of formed by Freud's daughter, Anna. And the big emphasis on ego psychology is how is the self, the ego, formed, and how is it defending itself against the outside world impinging upon it? And how is the self impacting the world, and how does the world impact the self? That's essentially ego psychology, and it focuses a lot on defense mechanisms. Object relations theory, though, focuses more on relating to other people. Big names in this particular arena are people like Margaret Mahler, Winnicott, Kohut, people like that. And so the theory kind of goes that our relationships in very young life, particularly with our mother, really impact how we relate to others in later life. And this has kind of evolved into the psychodynamic theory. Okay, it's no longer called object relations, but it's called psychodynamic. And people think to themselves, "Oh, well, there's not a lot of research that supports this," But really, what we're finding is there is quite a bit of support for the idea that our previous relationships have an impact on how we relate to the world now and the patterns that we kind of fall into. And so, while Freud's psychoanalytic theory may have kind of fallen by the wayside, psychodynamic theory has really kind of risen to a place of prominence in the field of counseling and psychology. And like I said, we'll talk about attachment theory next week. So let's talk a little bit about some reactionary theories to psychoanalysis. And this video down here kind of explains these two terms, but I'll go into them in just a brief bit. But in the 1950s, 60s, you had sort of kind of a rebellion against psychosexual theory and analysis, and you had a lot of emphasis on what became known as cognitive psychology. And one of the big names in cognitive psychology is Jean Piaget. And Piaget kind of came up with the idea that we develop schemas in our mind. And these schemas are mental representations of how we make sense of the world. And from these schemas, we behave and act upon the world and make, snap judgments and things like that. And two of the big concepts of Piaget's theory are assimilation and accommodation. Now, assimilation basically is the act of taking in new information. But it's not really changing the self based upon that new information. Okay? It's taking that new information, changing it to fit some scheme that we have already got in our heads. Accommodation, on the other hand, is where we take new information and we change the schemes that we've got based upon that new information. So, in assimilation, the person who's taking in the information does not change. The information changes. We interpret it in a certain way. In accommodation, the information changes the person, okay? Changes their schema. So this video down here will talk more about this in a little bit more exemplary terms, talking about the understanding a child has of a cat versus a dog. So I would encourage you to watch that if these terms are a bit muddling to you. So Piaget talked about his steps in his developmental theory as being fixed, meaning somebody's not going to start out at the formal operation stage. You're not going to have a 2-year-old who can, form a hypothesis and reason, like an adult can. Kids will start out at the sensory motor stage, and they will move forward through the pre-operational, the concrete operational, the formal operational stage. And as they do so, they gain skills and they gain understanding of the world that follow them as they move up. It's not like we forget how to, manipulate things with our hands when we're finally at the end here. No. People do accomplish these stages at different rates, but in general, they typically follow sort of a stepwise fashion, according to Piaget. Now, we talked last week about the limitations of a stepwise, discontinuous theory such as this, but it's good for understanding kind of a general sense of what people go through on average. Another big name in developmental theory is Lev Vygotsky, and he was a Russian scientist who came up with the idea that the environment plays a huge role in a child's development. And that does this through what he called the zone of proximal development. And the zone of proximal development is what is around the child that can help the child develop. Okay, so what can the child do? Okay, they can maybe put together a puzzle. That is, and if the puzzle is, I don't know, 300 pieces, a 300-piece puzzle. But they get confused and they don't really know how to do it if it's 700 or 800-piece puzzle. So a person, a family member, a friend, or another, child could come in and join the child in putting together this larger puzzle in order to help them accomplish this. And they would learn how to do that from those interactions. And from that, they would be better able to, by themselves, put together a 700 or 800-piece puzzle. And the way that the outside person helps with that is they use scaffolding techniques. So, for instance, if I were helping the child put together that 700-piece puzzle, perhaps I would construct the outside of the puzzle for them first and give them kind of a frame of reference to work from. Maybe I would flip over the pieces so that all of the tops would be showing. Maybe I would organize certain pieces of certain shapes in certain areas. I don't know. But it is the actions that the helper, that the person in the zone of proximal development uses to help the child develop. Let's go on to Bandura's social learning theory. Now, Bandura's social learning theory is still considered a cognitive theory of development because, well, I'll talk about why in just a second. But basically, Bandura's theory works off of the idea of modeling or watching people and observing. So he says, for instance, if a child observes somebody beating up on a Bobo doll, and then they are placed, and that person has a good time doing it, and they don't get in trouble or anything like that, and they're placed in the room with the Bobo doll, they're more likely to go at it with the Bobo doll and have a great time doing it. But if they see somebody who beats up on the Bobo doll and they get punished for it, well then perhaps when they're put into the room with the Bobo doll, the child will not mess with the Bobo doll. They will avoid it, perhaps. Bandura also came up with the idea that we learn through modeling and through imitation. So, for instance, right now, I'm teaching, right? I'm assuming an imitation of professors that I've had in the past and how they've taught me. And they are my models, and I am imitating them. Now, eventually this will come into its own for myself, and I will develop my own teaching styles and everything like that, but there will always be a little tinge of the models that have come before me that kind of impacts how I teach. And so I would recommend watching the video here. And I believe that video discusses the Bobo doll experiment and actually shows what it looks like. So why is Bandura's theory considered a cognitive theory? Why isn't it considered behavioral in nature? Well, there are behavioral components, okay? So, for instance, hitting the Bobo doll is the behavior, right? And the environmental determinants are what happens based upon that behavior. So either getting punished or not getting punished. The personal determinants, though, that's where the cognitive piece comes in. In order for an individual to learn vicariously, they have to project themselves mentally into the situation and apply either whatever the environmental determinant was, apply that to what might happen to them. So the child who sees the adult beating up on the Bobo doll and getting punished has to project themselves into the place of the adult and say, oh, they're getting punished. If I hit that thing, I'll get punished too because that person got punished. But if the person did not get punished and they had a good time doing it, oh, well, hey, look, that's for punching, and I won't get in trouble for punching that. They had fun, so I can have fun. That's the personal determinant. That's the cognitive aspect that determines the behavior. And that's why Bandura's social learning theory is still considered a cognitive theory of development. And the reason this applies to development is children who are too young may not be able to make this connection. They may not be able to cognitively represent themselves in the place of another person. So you might see them, regardless of what happens to the person hitting the Bobo doll, even if they get punished. The child may still go in there and beat up on the thing until they themselves get punished. But at a certain point, they're able to create that cognitive understanding of themselves. And that's whenever that's where we see the developmental growth. Classical learning theory, as proposed by Ivan Pavlov, is a strictly behavioral theory of development. Okay, and it's a learning theory. And so what it means, why this applies to behavior, or not behavior, developmental psychology is at certain points we're better apt or better able to learn certain things from this. Okay, you can train a child using this theory, but as they age, you are able to train them more and more based upon this. So for the midterm, I would expect you guys to know the difference between a conditioned stimulus, unconditioned stimulus, conditioned response, and unconditioned response. Basically know what this is. Know Pavlov's theory, classical learning theory, and be able to kind of describe it. Okay. So let's go over this just briefly. So you've got a unconditioned stimulus, which is the food, and that is something that elicits an unconditioned response naturally. Okay, so give a dog a bone, it's going to salivate, right? Put a pizza in front of me, watch me go. You know, I'm going to salivate too. But if you have something here, you know, a bell, and you ring it, you know, the dog's not going to salivate. It has no association with the food. It has no reason to salivate. But if you combine the unconditioned stimulus, which is the food, the bone, with what is now going to be the conditioned stimulus, which is the bell, is the stimulus that we're conditioning, then if you pair those two together enough times, eventually, and in close enough relation to one another, eventually the dog will begin to salivate to the bell, and that's called the conditioned response. Okay? So again, study this, learn it, read your book on it. It'll be on the midterm, promise. Okay, let's talk about operant conditioning. Now this was proposed by V.F. Skinner, and Skinner came up with the concept of reinforcements and punishments. Now reinforcements increase behavior, punishments decrease behavior. But he also came up with the concept of positive and negative. Now, in those two, and that combines with the reinforcement and punishment to create either positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, or negative punishment. Now, positive just simply means that something is administered. Okay? Something is given. Negative means something is taken away. Okay? So it's not a good, bad thing. It's not anything like that. It's not a judgment of what the reinforcement or punishment is. Is something given, is something taken away. This is an important distinction. Know it. Okay? So if I positively reinforce something, I'm, for instance, giving a piece of candy to a child for taking out the trash. The behavior is taking out the trash. I want to increase this behavior, so I am positively giving some candy after the child takes out the trash. Negative reinforcement, on the other hand, is where, for instance, the child does not like to eat Brussels sprouts. So anytime the child takes out the trash, they do not have to eat their Brussels sprouts. That is something they hate doing, so I'm taking that away in order to increase the behavior. That's negative reinforcement. Positive punishment, on the other hand, think of it as terms of spanking. You are administering a spanking in order to decrease a behavior. Spanking a child for hitting their sister, for instance. Negative punishment, think of it in terms of taking away something in order to decrease a behavior. So taking away privileges for hitting your sister in order to decrease that behavior. Again, know these distinctions. Every time I've taught this during the midterm, there's been one or two people who are confused on this topic. And so I want you guys to know this. If you have questions on it, ask me. If not, then we'll just, well, we're going to keep on going anyway because I'm talking to a computer right this second. Let's talk about Bronfenbrenner's systems theory. Now, Bronfenbrenner came up with the concept of, it's a very social model, okay? So he came up with the concept of various levels of influence that affect us. So we're in the middle here, and around us we have different levels of systems. We have the microsystem, mesosystem, meso meaning middle, exosystem, and then the macrosystem. But some researchers have also conceptualized what's known as the chronosystem, and we'll talk about that in a second. Let's talk about this, though. So the microsystem is the closest group of people who influence us. These are our parents, our teachers, our daycare workers, siblings, friends. They have the most immediate impact on us. But what impacts those people? Well, family members may be impacted by the neighborhood. They may be impacted by their religious settings, or perhaps the people who don't really have a big impact on us, maybe principals of the school, or pastors, or things like that. Those are the people that impact the people that impact us. Then you have the exosystem. This is like local government, perhaps, school boards, perhaps, our parents' workplace. Those things impact the settings that impact the people that impact us. Okay? Then the macro system. This is more of the cultural values, the societal norms that impact how local government or workplace values impact, the settings and the pastors and the school boards that impact the people that impact us. And then you've got the chronos system. That's the times, okay? We've heard the term zeitgeist, the spirit of the times. Think of it in terms of, like, let's give an example, 1960s to 1970s, hippie era, just going into the Vietnam War, things like that. And how maybe that impacted the local government, or how that impacted, like, the cultural values, and that impacted the local government, which impacted our neighborhood, which impacted our parents, which impacted us. So it's all kind of like an onion. The closer in you get, the more you get towards you, the more it impacts you. But it all has an impact on you in some either direct or indirect form. So let's talk a little bit about psychosocial theory and Erikson and Havinghurst. Okay? Havinghurst came up with what was known as the developmental task theory. And you can find this on page, a good listing of this in your book on page, here we are, page 69, table 3.1. And basically what Havinghurst said is that as we age, we have certain developmental tasks that we have to perform. For an infant, it's going to be learning how to manipulate the world around you, grow, how to grow up, perhaps developing attachment, learning to talk. For an adolescent, though, it would be something like developing social relationships, getting a job, going to school, things like that. Okay, so it's different for each age group. Erikson's theory, though, kind of focused more on psychosocial crises, and we'll talk about what he meant by crises in just a second. But basically, this is talking about how the interaction of the external environment on ourselves impacts us, and how we impact the external environment. So Erikson said that the strength acquired at any stage is tested by the necessity to transcend it in such a way that the individual can take chances in the next stage with what was most vulnerably precious in the previous one. What he means by that is, at each stage, we learn how to navigate that stage based upon what we learned in the previous stages. And then we take what we learned in that stage on to the next stage, and so on and so forth. And we keep learning, and we keep developing, we keep bettering ourselves based upon what we've learned. Now, Erikson, there are certain presuppositions he came in on with this. Everyone has a range of psychological strengths. Okay, so it's a very positive look on people. Okay, he said we come into this world with the capacity to learn and to develop. There's an expectable sequence through which these resources are called forth, and through which they develop. So somebody who is, an infant is not going to be expected to know how to get along in a group very well. They're not going to be expected to develop an intimacy with other people or generate new things. They're going to be expected to, be working on trust. So there's also, but that develops over time. Okay. Now, Erikson's conception of what a crisis is not, oh my gosh, I can't handle this. This is, going to destroy me. I'm going crazy over this. No, that's not what his crisis is. What his crisis is it's more of just kind of a pull between two opposite draws. Okay, and the crisis is the decision that we have to make between those. Are we going to become pathological, or are we going to become more positive in how more adaptive in how we navigate these certain periods in our life? So Erikson's theory basically asks and covers three different questions. Who can I trust? What can I achieve? And who am I? And it's kind of separated here between adolescence and adulthood. Up to adolescence, can I trust? Basically, this trust versus mistrust stage of infancy. Can I achieve? The initiative versus guilt stage, or the industry versus inferiority stage. Who am I? It's the identity versus role confusion stage. But later in life, we talk about things like, can I trust others? And that leads to intimacy versus isolation. Can I achieve? What can I create? Generativity versus stagnation. Who am I? What have I done? Integrity versus despair. So, each lecture that we have on that describes Erikson's theories is going to cover 7 different topics here. Okay, it's going to cover the central process, the radius of significant relationships, the adaptive ego quality, the core pathology, the principle of social order, ritualization, ritualism, and the theological lesson. Now, let me describe these real fast, because you are going to need to know these for the midterm. Okay, so the central process is more of what it's the psycho part of the psychosocial theory. It's how we organize and conceptualize how we interact with the world around us and make sense of it. The radius of significant relationships is the social aspect. It's the people around us, and it's the people through which the central process operates. So, for instance, trust versus mistrust stage would be the mother. That's who is our significant relationship at that point. The adaptive ego quality is the positive aspect that could develop through our positive navigation through this crisis. So it's the adaptive quality that is going to stick with us through the future stages. And you can get a idea of what these are on page 77, table 3-4. And these qualities include hope, will, purpose, competence, fidelity, love, care, wisdom, and confidence. These are the positive qualities. But on the opposite end of the spectrum, we could also navigate these stages in negative ways, developing pathologies. And these can be seen on page 78, table 3.5, and include withdrawal, compulsion, inhibition, inertia, dissociation, repudiation, exclusivity, rejectivity, disdain, and diffidence. We'll get into these as we go through the semester, but really Chapter 3 provides good tables that could act as resources for you in the future. So I would highly encourage you to like tab your book and just kind of refer back to these as we go through. It's a good place to kind of start your studies for the midterm. Now, you can kind of lump the central process of the raise of significant relationships together. You can kind of lump adaptive ego quality and core pathology together. And you can kind of lump these last two together as well. The principle of social order is our understanding that is gained of the reciprocal interaction between the self and the environment. So the principle of social order, your book doesn't really talk about this, but the principle of social order is what is it that I will understand about the world from what I am going through here. You know, am I going to understand that the world is a trustworthy place if I'm in the trust versus mistrust stage? Obviously, an infant isn't going to think at that level, but it's the principle that develops for the infant. The ritualism kind of stems from this principle. So if the world is mistrust, or it is not worthy of my trust, how am I going to navigate that? Am I going to move toward people, or am I going to pull away from them? And that kind of contributes to the core pathology as well. Let's talk about this, though. The ritualism. Think of it, ritualization is more of a positive aspect. Ritualism is more of a dogmatic negative aspect. Okay? So, and it exists on a continuum. And you can kind of see that a positive thing can become a negative if you have too much of it. So, for instance, the principle of social order in the trust versus mistrust stage is called cosmic order. And it's an understanding that the world is okay, that there is an order to things, that I'm going to get food if I cry, that this person that I'm here with, my mother, for instance, is trustworthy. The ritualism for the trust versus mistrust stage is numinous versus idealism. Okay, I'll talk about that. Basically, numinous is a sense that there is something greater than yourself, and for the infant, that's the mother. It's what they rely upon. It's what they depend upon. And that's a positive thing. The infant needs a sense of trust and ability to understand that it will be cared for. It gives a sense of hope. And that's what the adaptive ego quality for trust versus mistrust is. It's a sense of hope. But if taken too far, that sense of the numinous can turn into idealism. And that leads to dependency. Like, you've seen these children who just are clinging to their mother's leg and can't stand to be away from their mother, and just, if you try to interact with them without their mom, they freak out. Well, that's, idealism. That is, I can't exist, I can't cope without my comfort thing. It's almost taking the relationship and turning it into a thing. So we'll talk a little bit more about that throughout the semester, but this is a good slide to kind of refer back to for yourself and remind yourself of what these things are as we study Erikson. And then the theological lesson is proposed through the book Growing Up to God by John Gleason in 1975. And Gleason basically took Erikson's theory and said, okay, as someone progresses through these stages of psychosocial development, how does that apply to how we relate to God and how we grow in our relationship with God? And that's what Gleason really focused in on. So know these concepts. I hope that as we study the various stages of Erikson's model. They become kind of second nature to kind of think about for you. And this is really something you need to think about putting into like your Erikson presentations, maybe a slide that kind of touches on each one of these. Okay? So the last couple slides for this presentation just kind of are a review of the biopsychosocial spiritual theory and the various spiritual theories of development that were in the first week's lecture. So let's talk just a quick review of this. So transformational theories basically say that God reaches down and acts within us and transforms us and makes us open to a relationship with Him and impacts our development and nourishes it. Stage theories, though, kind of follow Piaget's model of kind of a stepwise understanding of God. And what we're going to be focusing in on is, in particular, Fowler's theory of religious development. We'll get into that in later lectures, but just know that that this is a stage model. Okay. Attachment theory focuses on how, like, our relationships with our parents impact our relationship with God. So, do we see God like we see our father, harsh and unforgiving, or do we see God like we see another father who is loving and caring and nurturing to the child? Socialization theory basically talks about how is our environment impacting how we relate to God. So, is there a pastor that we like? Do we watch Pat Robertson on the 700 Club? Are there certain negative things that have happened in the world? Earthquakes, tsunamis, hurricanes that cause us to kind of have sort of a why does this happen, God? And how we relate to God like that. That's socialization. And then Will Hoyt and Tony, we've already talked about him last week, and how they basically said, okay, you've got each of these different sorts of theories of development, and how do they relate to how we relate to God? And so they kind of tried to summarize that. So that does it for the week 2 lecture. Like I said, I will try to get week's 3 lecture up this evening as well. And if you have any questions on the material, feel free to email me or wait until the Blackboard Collaborate live class session on the 21st at 7. And I'll be glad to address any questions you have. Until then, thanks for watching, and good studies.